The problem in Russia is that the Russian government has not come to terms with the Stalinist period and communism. Now, everyone knows that communism was a disaster, but what the Russian people really are not aware of, they don't have the details. I think many of them know. Their instincts tell them this. Their fathers, grandfathers told them these things, but they are not really fully aware of the tens of millions of human beings that were murdered between 1918 and the beginning of the Second World War. Millions. And what people don't understand is that in 1939, when you had the Soviet-German pact between Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, and Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, this enabled Stalin and his armies to overrun Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and half of Finland, as well as nearly half of Poland. This resulted in the death either through deportation, execution, or simple exposure to the elements for millions of people that lived in those areas. That doesn't come up for discussion. Instead, everyone talks about, well, Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. There could not have been a Second World War without two things. First of all, without communism coming to power in 1918 and then consolidating its power through the murder of millions of human beings inside the Soviet Union, you would not have had the fear that emerged in the rest of Europe, particularly in Germany, where by the time Hitler is finally elected to office, and when I say elected, that's misleading, he had 32% of the vote, it was largely in response to the fear of communism inside Germany. People knew that millions were being starved to death, that somewhere between 7 and 10 million Ukrainians inside Ukraine were starved to death, an orchestrated famine. Those who were not starved to death deliberately by the removal of all food and the decimation of their families, the destruction of their property, were then shot on sight, raped and shot, or deported. And the difference between the concentration camp system that develops early in the 20s and lasts all the way into the early 1960s and the concentration camp that springs up after we go into, or after the Germans go into Eastern Europe, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, is that the concentration camps in Russia are in areas where the weather is so severe, the temperatures are so low, the food is so bad, the treatment meted out to the prisoners was so horrific, that within the first 30 days to 90 days to 6 months, almost everybody was dead. In other words, you didn't have to deliberately employ chemical means to eradicate the desired population. They died of exposure. And more people died between 1918 and 1941, we think, maybe more than died during the Second World War fighting against the Nazis. The other thing is that they talk about the Great Patriotic War, but 1.5 million so-called Soviet citizens volunteered for duty with the Wehrmacht. Hundreds of thousands of Russians, more than 250,000 Ukrainians, hundreds of thousands of Mongolian, Turkic, Armenian, Georgian people, Tartars, all of them saddled up as soon as they could with the Germans against communism. That's what people don't understand. There were 2 million Soviet prisoners of war sitting in camps that were ready to volunteer and go out and fight with the Germans against the Soviets, something that Hitler refused to do, which was a terrible mistake. In other words, people don't understand that communism was the real cause of this horrific war. Now, that doesn't absolve Hitler, but it changes the complexion of the discussion. I didn't expect Putin to mention all of it, but the notion that you could have had a war at all without Stalin is ludicrous nonsense. And even in more material terms, when the Germans finally attack the West, when they go into Scandinavia and they overrun the Low Countries, defeat the British and the French and France, all of the oil, all of the raw materials, the food, the gasoline, everything is from Russia, supplied by Stalin, because Stalin hoped that the Germans and the British and the French would end up in a World War I scenario, in a stalemate, which would then offer him opportunities to attack from behind. Didn't work out that way, did it? But, you know, the problem is the Russians need to know the truth. They closed down the NKVD archives. so that the Russians do not know the full truth. They were finding it out up until about 2001, 2002. People were becoming enraged when they found out that more than 15 Soviet soldiers died in the war. They were enraged when they found out that Stalin's NKVD executed 1 million Soviet soldiers who refused to fight the Germans. So this great patriotic war myth, if you will, is something they can't afford to destroy, or at least in their minds. Now, everything that was said about Tsarist Russia from 932 up to 1918 was true and accurate. And however many mistakes the Tsars may have made, and however inhumane from time to time may have been, compared with what followed them, they were wild-eyed humanitarians. That was my problem. Now, Tucker couldn't push back against the head of state and say, you're not telling us the truth about what happened with Stalin. That was beyond the scope of this thing. But I'm disappointed that no one in Russia will stand up and tell the truth. Stop pretending that there was something good that happened under communism. There wasn't. It was the evil empire. The good news is that today's Russia has nothing in common with it. And if anything, it looks more like Tsarist Russia, only with a much more humanitarian face and a much higher standard of living. We should all be grateful for that, and they should take great pride in that. That's my personal frustration, that the truth just hasn't hit the light.